Hello, my name is Desmond Carter, 28 years old. I am the owner of a small coffee shop called Memory Lane in Kernney, Nebraska, a tiny town nestled among endless cornfields where the vast blue sky seems to swallow all sorrows. Kernney isn't anything special, just a few quiet streets, an old-fashioned grocery store, and folks so familiar with each other that I can guess their orders the moment they step into my shop. Today is a crisp autumn day, the air carrying the scent of dry leaves and Nebraska's earthy essence. I'm sitting in a cozy corner of my shop at a worn wooden table by the window, looking out at a road where corn-laden trucks rumble by. In my hand is a steaming cup of black coffee, and in front of me is an old dusty box of photos. I dragged it out from the storage room after cleaning this morning, inexplicably drawn to revisit memories I had once tried to bury. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I lift the lid of the box, and the smell of old paper and time hits me. The photos are a jumble, some yellowed, some stuck together from humidity. I flip through them one by one as if turning the pages of my own life. One photo shows me at 5 years old standing next to my sister Abby, both of us wearing identical red sweaters, grinning ear to ear in front of a Christmas tree. Another captures my parents, Gregory and Karen Carter, dressed impeccably in a suit and dress, their eyes stern, as if playing the part of a perfect family in a commercial. And then I pause. My fingers tremble as they touch a small frayed photo. It's of my grandmother, Edith Carter, and me, taken in front of my Uncle Walter's house on the outskirts of Kernney. She's wearing a dark green sweater, her silver hair neatly pinned up, her cloudy eyes still sparkling with warmth. I, probably 16 or 17 at the time, stand beside her, holding her hand, my smile strained as if hiding something. That photo cuts through me like a sharp, unexpected knife slicing across my thoughts. Memories flood back unbidden, like a torrent breaching the walls I've built around my heart. I see my grandmother's bewildered eyes again, her trembling hand clutching mine at the airport years ago. I hear her calling my name, her frail voice filled with love amidst the clamor of the crowd. And I see myself, an 18-year-old kid, standing at a crossroads of choices, unsure of what I was doing, only knowing I couldn't leave her alone. I take a sip of coffee, trying to swallow the lump in my throat. Setting the photo down, I pull an old notebook from my jacket pocket and open it to a blank page. I need to write this story down, not to blame or resent, but to remember what saved me. I grew up in Lincoln, Nebraska, about 3 hours from Kernney. Our house was a 2-story white painted home with a meticulously trimmed lawn. My father, Gregory Carter, was a financial officer, always in a crisp suit, speaking slowly but sharply, as if every word was calculated. My mother, Karen, was a nurse, a perfectionist who rarely smiled at home. My sister Abby, 3 years younger, was gentle and shy, always trying to please everyone. From the outside, our family was picture perfect, but inside, our home was cold, like a museum where everything was arranged for display, not for living. My father often spoke of filial piety, yet when his own mother called for help, he'd brush her off with irritation. My grandmother, Edith Carter, lived on a small farm where fields of wheat and corn stretched to the horizon. She had been an elementary school teacher, with a gentle voice that carried sunshine in every word. Every summer I spent there felt like sanctuary, helping my grandfather plant seeds while Grandma baked butter cookies and shared stories. But when I was 14, my grandfather died suddenly from a heart attack. From then on, Grandma began to change. She forgot to cook, forgot my name, sometimes calling me Billy, an old friend from her teaching days. She'd stand at the door, staring down the road as if waiting for my grandfather to return. When I was 16, during Thanksgiving, we drove to Grandma's farm. Uncle Richard and Aunt Linda were already there, their loud voices carrying from inside. The tension was thick. Everyone had been arguing about what to do with Grandma. Dinner started quietly enough until Grandma suddenly spoke up, her voice clearer than it had been in months. "I've been thinking about what happens to me and to this place." She gestured around the dining room. "I'm not stupid, Gregory. I know what's happening to me. The forgetting, the confusion, but I'm still lucid enough to make decisions about my own life." Uncle Richard leaned forward, suddenly interested. "What kind of decisions, Mom?" "Whoever takes care of me, really takes care of me, not just talks about it, will inherit this farm, and my savings, and the life insurance policy." The silence that followed was deafening. Then Uncle Richard and my father began arguing, talking about Grandma as if she weren't sitting right there. "Enough!" Grandma's voice cracked like a whip. "I won't have my sons fighting over me like vultures over carrion." She turned to my father. "Gregory, you have a stable home and medical knowledge through Karen. If you're willing to take me in, truly take me in, then that's what we'll do." My father straightened up. "Of course, Mom, we'd be honored." But I caught the look he exchanged with my mother. It wasn't honor I saw there. It was opportunity. The move happened quickly. Within 2 weeks, Grandma's belongings were packed and loaded into a rental truck. Our guest room became her new home, filled with her familiar things: crocheted blankets, ceramic birds, and the photo of my grandfather she always kept close. For the first few months, everything seemed promising. Mom took Grandma to doctor appointments and made sure she took her medications. Dad would sit with her in the living room, asking about her day, nodding patiently when she repeated stories. Family takes care of family. That's what real filial piety looks like. He said it with such conviction that I almost believed he meant it. Grandma settled in nicely. She enjoyed watching morning news with her coffee and helping Mom in the kitchen, even when she forgot what she was doing. But I began to notice small things: the way my parents exchanged glances when Grandma asked the same question 3 times, how Dad's patience wore thin when she called him by my grandfather's name. The first real incident happened on a Tuesday evening in March. I smelled something burning and rushed downstairs to find the kitchen full of smoke. Grandma stood in front of the stove, confused and frightened. "I was making cookies for Billy. He loves my butter cookies." The pan was charred black, burnt sugar crusted on the burner. Mom came running, took one look at the mess, and her face went white. "Mom, you can't use the stove anymore," she said sharply. "You could have burned the house down." That night I heard my parents talking downstairs, words like safety and responsibility and can't watch her every minute. The next morning they installed child-proof locks on the kitchen cabinets and a timer system on the stove. Grandma accepted these changes without complaint, but I saw how she would stand in the kitchen doorway, looking lost and small. I was beginning to see that my father's version of difficult choices had very little to do with difficulty and everything to do with choosing what benefited him most. The breaking point came 6 months later, on a night when the Nebraska sky opened up with the fury of a summer storm. Rain lashed against the windows, and thunder rolled across the plains like the voice of an angry god. I was in my room, supposedly studying for my SATs, but actually reading a paperback novel, when I heard my father shouting downstairs. "Where is she? Karen, where is she?" I rushed to the top of the stairs and saw my parents in the front hallway, my father dripping wet from having just come in from outside, my mother still in her nurse's scrubs. "I don't know," Mom said, her voice high with panic. "She was watching television when I left for work. She was right there in her chair." "Well, she's not there now," Dad snapped. "The front door was standing wide open when I got home." My stomach dropped. "Grandma's missing?" "Get your coat," Dad ordered. "We're going to drive around the neighborhood." But I was already running down the stairs, grabbing my rain jacket. "I'll check the park," I said, thinking of how Grandma sometimes talked about wanting to feed the ducks at the small pond nearby. The rain was coming down in sheets, and the wind was fierce enough to nearly knock me off my bike. I pedaled through the empty streets, calling Grandma's name, my voice barely audible over the storm. I checked the park first, empty except for a few scattered ducks huddled under the pavilion. Then I rode through the shopping center parking lot, past the closed stores. I was about to head back home when I remembered something Grandma had said a few days earlier. She'd been looking through her photo album, touching a picture of my grandfather, and she'd whispered, "He's waiting for me by our tree." Their tree. The old oak in Pioneers Park where they'd had their first date more than 50 years ago. I pedaled as fast as I could through the storm, my clothes soaked through, rain streaming down my face. The park was dark and deserted, but I knew exactly where to find the tree. It stood on a small hill overlooking the creek, its massive trunk scarred by decades of carved initials. And there she was, huddled at the base of the oak tree, still in her nightgown and thin robe, clutching a framed photograph to her chest. She was shivering violently, her silver hair plastered to her head, but her eyes were closed, and there was a small smile on her face. "Grandma!" I dropped my bike and ran to her, shrugging out of my jacket to wrap around her shoulders. "What are you doing here?" She opened her eyes and looked at me with such clarity that it took my breath away. "Desmond, what are you doing here, sweetheart?" "Looking for you. Mom and Dad are worried sick. We need to get you home." We made it back to the house just as my father was pulling into the driveway. He jumped out of the car and ran toward us, relief and anger warring on his face. "Where the hell were you?" he demanded. "Pioneers Park." She was sitting by the old oak tree. We got Grandma into a hot shower and then into warm, dry clothes. I made her tea while Mom checked her over for signs of hypothermia. "I was waiting for Harold," she said, referring to my grandfather. "He always said if we got separated, we should meet at our tree." "Mom," Dad said, his voice strained with barely controlled frustration. "Harold died 4 years ago. You know that." The confusion returned to Grandma's eyes, and she looked so lost that it broke my heart. "He did?" That night, after Grandma had gone to bed, my parents had another hushed conference in the living room, but this time their voices carried clearly up the stairs. "She could have died out there," Mom said. "Hypothermia, pneumonia, at her age, it could have killed her." "I know that, but what are our options? We can't watch her 24 hours a day." "Maybe it's time to consider a nursing home." "You know what those places cost? And besides, what would people think?" The next morning at breakfast, I couldn't stay quiet anymore. "Maybe Grandma would be happier back at the farm," I said, looking up from my cereal bowl. My father's coffee cup stopped halfway to his lips. "What did you say?" "The farm. She's always talking about it. Maybe she'd be less confused somewhere familiar." "The farm is gone, Desmond," Mom said gently. "It's been sold." I rushed to the top of the stairs and saw my parents in the front hallway, my father dripping wet from having just come in from outside, my mother still in her nurse's scrubs. "I don't know," Mom said, her voice high with panic. "She was watching television when I left for work. She was right there in her chair." "Well, she's not there now," Dad snapped. "The front door was standing wide open when I got home." My stomach dropped. "Grandma's missing?" "Get your coat," Dad ordered. "We're going to drive around the neighborhood." But I was already running down the stairs, grabbing my rain jacket. "I'll check the park," I said, thinking of how Grandma sometimes talked about wanting to feed the ducks at the small pond nearby. The rain was coming down in sheets, and the wind was fierce enough to nearly knock me off my bike. I pedaled through the empty streets, calling Grandma's name, my voice barely audible over the storm. I checked the park first, empty except for a few scattered ducks huddled under the pavilion. Then I rode through the shopping center parking lot, past the closed stores. I was about to head back home when I remembered something Grandma had said a few days earlier. She'd been looking through her photo album, touching a picture of my grandfather, and she'd whispered, "He's waiting for me by our tree." Their tree. The old oak in Pioneers Park where they'd had their first date more than 50 years ago. I pedaled as fast as I could through the storm, my clothes soaked through, rain streaming down my face. The park was dark and deserted, but I knew exactly where to find the tree. It stood on a small hill overlooking the creek, its massive trunk scarred by decades of carved initials. And there she was, huddled at the base of the oak tree, still in her nightgown and thin robe, clutching a framed photograph to her chest. She was shivering violently, her silver hair plastered to her head, but her eyes were closed, and there was a small smile on her face. "Grandma!" I dropped my bike and ran to her, shrugging out of my jacket to wrap around her shoulders. "What are you doing here?" She opened her eyes and looked at me with such clarity that it took my breath away. "Desmond, what are you doing here, sweetheart?" "Looking for you. Mom and Dad are worried sick. We need to get you home." We made it back to the house just as my father was pulling into the driveway. He jumped out of the car and ran toward us, relief and anger warring on his face. "Where the hell were you?" he demanded. "Pioneers Park." She was sitting by the old oak tree. We got Grandma into a hot shower and then into warm, dry clothes. I made her tea while Mom checked her over for signs of hypothermia. "I was waiting for Harold," she said, referring to my grandfather. "He always said if we got separated, we should meet at our tree." "Mom," Dad said, his voice strained with barely controlled frustration. "Harold died 4 years ago. You know that." The confusion returned to Grandma's eyes, and she looked so lost that it broke my heart. "He did?" That night, after Grandma had gone to bed, my parents had another hushed conference in the living room, but this time their voices carried clearly up the stairs. "She could have died out there," Mom said. "Hypothermia, pneumonia, at her age, it could have killed her." "I know that, but what are our options? We can't watch her 24 hours a day." "Maybe it's time to consider a nursing home. You know what those places cost? And besides, what would people think?" The next morning at breakfast, I couldn't stay quiet anymore. "Maybe Grandma would be happier back at the farm," I said, looking up from my cereal bowl. My father's coffee cup stopped halfway to his lips. "What did you say?" "The farm. She's always talking about it. Maybe she'd be less confused somewhere familiar." "The farm is gone, Desmond," Mom said gently. "It's been sold."
But I knew that wasn't true. I'd overheard enough conversations to know the farm was still sitting empty. "No, it's not," I said. "It's still there. Uncle Walter would help us fix it up." Dad set down his coffee cup with enough force to make it rattle. "That's enough. Your grandmother is our responsibility now, and we'll decide what's best for her." "But what if what's best for her isn't what's best for you?" The words hung in the air like a challenge. Dad's face went red, and for a moment, I thought he might actually yell at me. "You're 17 years old, Desmond. You don't know anything about adult responsibilities." But I was beginning to understand more than he realized. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. 2 weeks after the storm incident, I started having trouble sleeping. It wasn't just worry about Grandma, but something else, some nagging feeling that things were happening in our house that I wasn't supposed to know about. It started with phone calls that ended abruptly when I walked into the room, conversations between my parents that stopped mid-sentence when I came downstairs, and there was something different in the way they looked at Grandma, a kind of calculating patience that made my skin crawl. The night I learned the truth was a Thursday in late September. I'd gone to bed early, claiming I had a headache, but really, I just wanted to escape the tension building in our house. I was awakened by voices coming from my parents' bedroom across the hall. At first, I tried to ignore them and go back to sleep, but something in my father's tone, urgent, almost angry, made me get up and creep closer to my door. "Can't keep this up indefinitely," Dad was saying. "She's getting worse every week." "I know that," Mom replied, "but what are our choices?" "That's not what I'm talking about, and you know it." There was a long pause. I pressed my ear closer to the door. "Gregory, what are you suggesting?" I'm suggesting we need a long-term solution, one that takes care of the problem permanently. Another pause. When Mom spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. "You're talking about the trip to Africa." My heart stopped. What trip to Africa? "It's perfect," Dad continued. "A family vacation, educational for the kids. And if Mom gets confused at the airport, well, these things happen with elderly people who have dementia." "You want to abandon her at the airport?" "I want to give her a chance to live out her remaining years somewhere she can get professional care without bankrupting our family." "Professional care? Gregory, you're talking about leaving her in a foreign country where she doesn't know anyone." "She doesn't know anyone here anymore either. Half the time, she doesn't even recognize us. At least this way, we can move on with our lives." "And the inheritance?" There was rustling of papers. "Without the proper documentation, which she probably lost somewhere, we could petition the court to declare her estate abandoned. As her closest relatives, we'd be entitled to everything." I stumbled backward from the door, my mind reeling. They were planning to abandon Grandma, actually abandon her, like she was luggage they didn't want to carry anymore. I couldn't listen anymore. I crawled back into bed and pulled the covers over my head, but I couldn't shut out what I'd heard. My parents were planning to abandon a helpless old woman in a foreign country. And that helpless old woman was my grandmother, who had baked me cookies and taught me how to plant seeds and told me stories about her days as a teacher. I lay awake for the rest of the night trying to figure out what I was supposed to do with this terrible knowledge. I was 17 years old, still dependent on my parents for everything. Who would believe me if I told them what I'd heard?
But I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't let this happen. Whatever it took, however I had to do it, I would not let my parents abandon my grandmother. The Africa trip was presented to us over dinner the following Sunday. Dad had made a special effort. Steaks on the grill, Mom's famous potato salad, even a tablecloth on the picnic table. Abby and I exchanged glances. Our parents only went to this much trouble when they had something important to announce. "Your mother and I have been talking," Dad began, cutting into his steak with surgical precision. "We think it would be good for this family to take a vacation together. Broaden our horizons." "Where?" Abby asked, though she looked more worried than excited. "Africa," Mom said, smiling that bright, artificial smile she wore when trying to sell us on something. "Specifically, a safari in Kenya. 2 weeks of wildlife viewing and educational opportunities." I kept my face carefully neutral, even as my stomach churned. "What about Grandma?" "Oh, she'll come with us, of course," Dad said, not missing a beat. "It'll be wonderful for her. A real adventure." I looked over at Grandma, who was slowly chewing her steak and gazing off toward the neighbor's fence. She'd been having more bad days lately, moments where she didn't seem to recognize any of us. The days that followed were a blur of fake enthusiasm and careful observation. My parents went through all the motions of planning a real family vacation, but I watched for the tells. Dad spent time on the phone with travel agents, but I noticed he only bought 4 return tickets, not 5. Mom talked excitedly about safari lodges, but when I looked at the confirmation emails she left open on the computer, I saw reservations for only 4 people. The night before our departure, I helped Grandma pack her suitcase. She was having a good day and seemed genuinely excited about the trip. "I've never been to Africa," she told me as I folded her sweaters. "Harold always wanted to go on a safari, but we never had the money. He would have loved this." "Grandma," I said, sitting on the edge of her bed, "if something happened and you got separated from us on this trip, what would you do?" She looked at me with those cloudy eyes, and for a moment I saw a flash of the sharp intelligence that used to define her. Why would I get separated from my family? I wanted to tell her everything. I wanted to warn her about what was coming, but what could I say? That her son was planning to abandon her? Instead, I took her hand. "I just want you to know that I love you, Grandma, no matter what happens." She squeezed my fingers. "I love you too, sweetheart. You've always been my special boy." The next morning dawned gray and drizzly. We loaded our suitcases into Dad's car and drove to the Omaha airport in relative silence. Grandma sat in the front passenger seat, looking out at the familiar Nebraska landscape rolling by. At the airport, everything went according to my parents' script. We checked in, went through security, found our gate. Grandma was alert and cooperative, even seeming to enjoy the bustle of the terminal. About 30 minutes before boarding, Dad announced he was getting coffee. Mom went with him, but I saw Dad veer off toward the customer service desk instead. I positioned myself where I could see him talking earnestly to the woman behind the counter, handing her some papers. When the boarding announcement came, my parents stood up, gathering their carry-on bags. "Come on, everyone, time to go." Grandma struggled to her feet, her movements slower and more uncertain than earlier. The stress of travel was taking its toll. "Where are we going again?" she asked, looking around the terminal with worried eyes. "On vacation, Mom," Dad said patiently. "Remember? Africa?" But I could see that she didn't remember. The excitement from earlier had faded, replaced by fearful bewilderment. We got in line with the other passengers. I was right behind Grandma, close enough to catch her if she stumbled. Ahead of us, my parents showed their boarding passes and walked down the jetway. "Next," the agent said. Grandma fumbled in her purse for her boarding pass. I could see her growing agitated as she searched. Tissues, medication bottles, hard candy, but no boarding pass. "I can't find it," she whispered to me. "I know I had it." That's when I realized this was the moment. This was how they planned to do it. Let her get confused, let her hold up the line, then claim they had to board without her. I looked down the jetway where my parents had disappeared, then at my grandmother's frightened face, then at my sister Abby standing uncertainly beside me. And I made my choice. "Ma'am," I said to the gate agent, "my grandmother and I won't be boarding this flight." The agent looked confused. "Is there a problem?" "No problem," I said, taking Grandma's arm gently. "We've just decided not to go." I led Grandma away from the gate, Abby trailing behind us with wide, frightened eyes. "Desmond, what are you doing?" she whispered. "The right thing," I said. By the time my parents realized we weren't on the plane, it was too late. I'd used the airport payphone to call Uncle Walter, Grandma's younger brother, who lived on a modest farm in Kernney. "Walter," I said when he answered, "it's Desmond. I'm at the airport with Grandma, and we need help." I didn't have to explain much. Walter had always known what kind of man his nephew Gregory was, and he didn't ask uncomfortable questions. He just said, "I'll be there in 3 hours. Find somewhere to wait." Those 3 hours in the airport were the longest of my life. Grandma kept asking where my parents had gone, and I didn't know how to answer. Abby sat beside us in shocked silence, torn between loyalty to our parents and the growing realization of what they had tried to do. When she finally spoke, her voice was small and scared. "Mom and Dad are going to be so angry." "Let them be angry. Some things are more important than keeping the peace." When Uncle Walter arrived, he was exactly as I remembered him from childhood visits. A tall and lean man with kind eyes and calloused hands that spoke of a lifetime of honest work. He took one look at Grandma sitting in the airport chair, looking small and confused, and his jaw tightened. "Let's get you home, Edith," he said gently, helping her to her feet. The bus ride to Kernney took 4 hours, winding through small towns and endless farmland. Grandma dozed against the window while I stared out at the landscape, wondering what I'd done to my life. I was 18 years old, with no money, no plan, and parents who would probably never forgive me. But when I looked at my grandmother's peaceful face as she slept, I knew I'd made the right choice. Walter's farm was exactly as I remembered it from childhood visits, a modest white farmhouse surrounded by fields of corn and soybeans, with a red barn that had seen better days. His wife Mary met us at the door, her round face creased with concern and kindness. "Oh, Edith," she said, wrapping my grandmother in a gentle hug. "Welcome home, sweetheart." They settled us into the guest bedroom without fuss or questions. Mary made us sandwiches and hot tea, while Walter called my parents' hotel in Kenya to inform them that Grandma was safe and cared for. That first night, as I lay in the narrow bed listening to the sounds of the countryside, crickets chirping, cattle lowing in the distance, the whisper of wind through cornstalks, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Peace. For the first time since my grandfather died, Grandma seemed truly at ease. The familiar rural surroundings triggered something in her memory, and she moved through the farmhouse with more confidence than she'd shown in months.
"This is like home," she told me the next morning as we sat on the front porch, watching the sunrise paint the fields gold. "This feels right." And it did feel right. Here, among people who valued love over appearances, Grandma could simply be herself, confused sometimes, but always cherished. Here, I could be the grandson she remembered, not the prop in my parents' performance of family virtue. My phone buzzed constantly with angry messages from my parents, but I turned it off and put it in a drawer. Whatever consequences awaited me, they could wait. Right now, all that mattered was that my grandmother was safe, surrounded by love, in a place that felt like home. 3 weeks into our stay at Walter's farm, he pulled me aside one evening after dinner. We walked out to the old oak tree behind the barn, the same spot where he used to push me on a tire swing when I was little. "Desmond," he said, his weathered hands clasped behind his back, "there's something I need to show you, something Edith gave me to keep safe a long time ago." He led me back to the house and into a small study, where he opened an old filing cabinet and withdrew a manila envelope, yellowed with age. My name was written on it in Grandma's careful script. "She gave this to me right after your grandfather died," Walter explained. "Said she had a feeling things might get complicated with Gregory, and she wanted to make sure certain documents were protected." My hands trembled as I opened the envelope. Inside were the original property deeds to the farm, bank statements showing substantial savings, and a life insurance policy worth far more than I'd ever imagined. But there was something else. A letter addressed to me, dated 4 years ago. "My dearest Desmond," it began. "If you're reading this, it means I was right to worry about what would happen to me as my mind begins to fail. I've watched you grow into a young man of conscience and compassion, and I know that when the time comes, you'll do what's right, even when it's difficult. Your father is my son, and I love him, but I've seen how he values appearances over truth, money over love. I don't want my final years to be spent as a burden or a commodity. I want them to be spent with someone who sees me as a person worth caring for. Everything I have, the farm, the savings, the insurance, it's all yours now. Not because you're my heir, but because you're my heart. Use it wisely, and remember that the greatest inheritance I can give you is the knowledge that love is always the right choice. All my love, Grandma Edith." I looked up at Walter through tear-blurred eyes. She knew this would happen. "Edith always was the smartest one in the family," Walter said gently. "She saw through Gregory's act long before anyone else did." "But, Uncle Walter, I can't accept this. It's too much. She's still alive. She might need—" "Son," he interrupted, "your grandmother made this decision when her mind was completely clear. She wanted you to have security, to be able to take care of her without depending on people who would use her as a bargaining chip." That night, I sat with Grandma on the front porch, watching fireflies dance in the gathering dusk. She was having one of her good days, and her eyes were bright and alert. "Grandma," I said carefully, Do you remember giving Uncle Walter some papers for me? She nodded slowly. The envelope. Yes, I remember. She reached over and patted my hand. You found it? Yes, ma'am. But Grandma, it's so much. I don't know if I deserve... Deserve? She turned to look at me directly. Desmond, you gave up your family for me. You chose love over comfort, principle over convenience. If that doesn't deserve everything I have to give, then nothing does. The next morning, we drove into town to see Mr. Thompson, the local lawyer who had helped Grandma with her affairs for decades. He was a kind man with a white mustache and gentle manner, and he didn't seem surprised to see us.
"I've been expecting you," he said, ushering us into his office. "Your grandmother called me years ago to set up the trust. Everything's been legally transferred already. I was just waiting for you to claim it." "What about my parents?" I asked. "Won't they contest this?" Mr. Thompson smiled. "They can try, but your grandmother was very thorough. Multiple witnesses, psychological evaluations proving her competency at the time of signing, and documentation of her wishes going back several years. They don't have a legal leg to stand on." As we walked out of the lawyer's office, I felt the weight of responsibility settling on my shoulders. I was 18 years old, suddenly wealthy, and completely responsible for the care of the woman who had sacrificed everything for my moral education. But for the first time in my life, I felt ready for that responsibility. The months that followed were the most bittersweet of my life. Grandma's condition continued to deteriorate slowly, but surrounded by love and familiar countryside, she seemed more at peace than she had in years. I enrolled in online college courses so I could stay close to home. Walter taught me how to manage the farm's finances and care for the land that would someday be mine. Mary showed me how to cook Grandma's favorite meals and how to handle her increasingly difficult days with patience and grace. Some days were harder than others. Grandma would forget where she was or become agitated when she couldn't find my grandfather. But there were also moments of startling clarity, when she would look at me with those bright eyes and tell me stories I'd never heard before, or share wisdom that seemed to come from some deep well of accumulated love. "The secret to a good life," she told me one afternoon as we sat in her garden, watching tomatoes ripen in the summer sun, "is to love people more than things, and to remember that kindness is never wasted, even when it seems to go unnoticed." She taught me how to make her famous butter cookies, her hands guiding mine as we measured flour and sugar. "Every recipe is really a love letter," she said. "When you make these after I'm gone, you'll be reading mine." My high school graduation came in May. I hadn't planned to attend the ceremony. It seemed pointless without my parents there to watch. But Grandma insisted. Walter drove us to Lincoln, and we sat in the back row of the auditorium while I walked across the stage to receive my diploma. Later, looking at the graduation photo Mary had taken of Grandma and me outside the school, I saw something precious in her expression. Pride mixed with a kind of peaceful satisfaction, as if she knew she had accomplished something important. My parents tried to contact me several times over the months, threatening legal action and demanding to know Grandma's condition. I ignored most of their calls, but finally agreed to speak with my mother when she called in tears, claiming she missed her mother-in-law. "She's happy," I told her simply. "She's surrounded by people who love her, and she's at peace. Isn't that what you wanted for her?" The long silence on the other end of the line told me everything I needed to know. Grandma passed away on a Tuesday morning in October, just as the corn was being harvested. She died peacefully in her sleep, and her last words the night before had been to tell me how proud she was of the man I'd become. The funeral was small. Just Walter's family, a few neighbors, and some of her former students who had driven out from town to pay their respects. My parents didn't come, and I realized I was relieved by their absence. We buried her next to my grandfather in the small cemetery overlooking the fields they had worked together for so many years. As I stood at her graveside listening to the pastor read from Psalms,
I felt not just grief, but gratitude for the time we had had, for the lessons she had taught me, and for the courage she had given me to choose love over fear.
That brings me back to today, sitting in my coffee shop 10 years later, surrounded by photos and memories, and the quiet satisfaction of a life lived according to principle rather than convenience. I used Grandma's inheritance to buy this building in Kernney and convert it into Memory Lane. It's not just a coffee shop. It's a community gathering place where the elderly folks from the nursing home come to play cards, where high school students study for exams, and where anyone who needs a listening ear can find one. The walls are covered with photographs from the town's history, including several of Grandma during her teaching days. Her butter cookie recipe is framed behind the counter, and I make a fresh batch every Tuesday morning, just like she taught me. I never went to college in the traditional sense, but I've learned more about life and love and responsibility than any classroom could have taught me. The farm is still producing. Walter manages it now, and when he retires, I'll take over completely. It's good land, and it's been in our family for 3 generations. Now it will stay that way. My sister Abby visits sometimes. She went to college, got married, and lives in Colorado now, with her husband and 2 small children. She's never quite forgiven our parents for what they tried to do, but she's also never quite forgiven me for forcing her to see it. Our relationship is complicated, but it's built on truth now instead of polite fiction. As for my parents, we speak occasionally, but carefully. They live their lives in Lincoln, maintaining their perfect suburban facade, attending their social functions and church services. They've never apologized for what they tried to do, but they've also never tried to challenge Grandma's will. I think, deep down, they know they were wrong. This morning, as I sit here with these old photographs spread before me, I'm thinking about legacy. Not the kind that's measured in dollars or property deeds, but the kind that lives in the choices we make when nobody's watching, in the courage to stand up for what's right, even when it costs us everything we thought we wanted. The late afternoon sun is slanting through the windows of Memory Lane, painting everything in gold. In a few hours, I'll close up shop and drive out to the cemetery to put fresh flowers on Grandma's grave. Then I'll go home to the farmhouse, where I've learned that love is not just an emotion, but a daily choice, a commitment to seeing the humanity in others, even when they can no longer see it in themselves. Outside my window, a corn-laden truck rumbles down Main Street, heading toward the grain elevator. It's harvest time again, and the fields are golden with the promise of another season's growth. In this small town where everyone knows everyone else's story, I've found something my parents never understood: that the most valuable inheritance is not what we accumulate, but what we give away. And that true family is not defined by blood, but by the willingness to sacrifice for love. I close the photo album and put it back in its box. Some memories are too precious to examine too often, but some stories need to be told, to remind us all that in a world that often values success over compassion, there are still people willing to choose love over convenience, principle over profit. And sometimes that choice makes all the difference.